Once you've assessed your participants' cardiorespiratory fitness using either a maximal or a submaximal cardiovascular test, you're responsible now for designing an individualized cardiorespiratory training program. And the training programs is going to depend on the individual. It's going to depend on their goals. It's going to depend on how much time they have, how frequently they can exercise, and all of these factors are going to affect the frequency that they exercise, the intensity that they exercise, the time that they're able to exercise, the mode, and also the volume and how quickly you're able to progress them. So those are key variables that you're going to need to learn to individualize from the person. And what we're going to talk about today is lots of different factors that you can use from your cardiorespiratory endurance test to be able to personalize the exercise prescription for your person. So first, the elements of a cardiorespiratory workout are warm-up, and this warm-up is generally about 5 to 10 minutes. And the purpose of the warm-up is to increase the blood flow to working cardiac and skeletal muscles. So if you think about the workout, it should be dynamic, increase body temperature, also decrease chance of muscle and joint injury, and just by warming up the cardiovascular system, warming up the muscles for the person, increasing blood flow to the muscles, those are going to be responsible for reducing the chance of muscle and joint injury. And also the warm-up period, especially for people with cardiovascular disease, it also tends to play a really important role in lessening the chance of cardiac arrhythmias, so abnormal cardiac rhythms. And also, when you think about those first few minutes of exercise, those first few minutes before you reach steady state, before you're really warmed up, it's a really difficult time to be exercising. It's really uncomfortable. And so, especially for people that are not used to exercising, those first few minutes should be a bit slower, trying to ease the person more into the exercise so that those first few minutes aren't torture for them. In addition, the next part of the session should essentially be the aerobic conditioning phase. And so this is essentially the time when you're thinking about how to improve the cardiorespiratory endurance of your individual. So it should be whether it's a continuous or a discontinuous session, it should be about 20 to 60 minutes, and you want to plan it according to the frequency, intensity, time, and type that you've decided for your person, so the FIT principles. And then after the aerobic conditioning phase, it's recommended that you do some kind of cool down, and this tends to reduce the chance of pooling of blood in the lower extremities, and this can cause hypotension, which could cause your person to pass out. It could also cause cardiac arrhythmias, and it's a good time just for your person to walk. You could also incorporate some dynamic stretches, moving, and when I say stretches, I mean stretches just moving the joints through a full range of motion. Could be very similar to how you started the initial period of the warm-up, but you're trying to bring the person's heart rate and blood pressure closer or more close to what it was resting. It's not going to reach resting because you'll still be exercising, but closer to resting values. And then if it's appropriate for your person, this is a good time to perform some kind of stretching activities. The joints are warm, the muscles are warm, so it's less likely that you will cause any kind of muscular damage, or you will overstretch. And so, and also static stretching. If you decide to do static stretching where you're holding the stretching for any period of time, this tends to reduce the muscle force that can be produced after stretching. So this is a good time to do this is after you're done with your exercise session, when the actual performance of the exercise won't be affected by the reduction in force that stretching has caused. And for people, especially people as they get older, their muscles tend to become less pliable. The fascia, the muscle tends to become less pliable. The ligaments and the tendons are a little less compliant. And so once the person is warmed up after exercise, this is a really good time just to help them to allow their body to get back to healthy posture, get them to think about assuming a healthy posture, and really helping them to move their joints through a full range of motion. Because if you think about it, unless people exercise, unless people are consciously thinking about moving their joints through a full range of motion, they are probably not going to do it. And when we don't move our joints through a full range of motion, we don't allow the synovial fluid lubrication of those joints. And that synovial fluid is responsible for maintaining the health of the joints. So stretching can be useful for some populations. So when we think about prescribing exercise, we'll always come back to this. We're thinking about the FIT principle, and this was in chapter 3. Think about the frequency, how many times are they going to exercise, and usually we think about this per week. The intensity of exercise, and we'll talk a lot about how to prescribe cardiovascular exercise intensity. The time for the exercise, how long, whether it's a single bout or whether it's several bouts in the day. The type of exercise, what modalities are good for improving cardiovascular fitness. And some of this will depend on, or much of this actually will depend on your person's goals. What are they hoping to get out of the exercise? What kind of performance are they hoping to improve? Also, we'll be thinking about the volume of exercise, and the volume of exercise depends on the frequency, the intensity, and the time that exercise is performed. And then we'll talk about how to progress exercise, and that'll depend on the person's goals, the person's susceptibility to injury. So we'll talk about those things. But when you're designing your individualized exercise prescription, you need to address all of these things. At least start your person somewhere and then modify from there, and we'll talk about those today. But exercise prescription is an art. So a lot like medicine. Medicine's also kind of an art. In that exercise prescription should be, there's no like one formula that you can just plug in and then everyone will respond the same, because we respond to exercise in very individual fashion. So it's important for us to individualize the exercise prescription. And as you work with people, you'll be able to, you start them with an exercise prescription and individualize that. But as you work with them, you will be constantly tweaking and individualizing that exercise prescription to help to meet their needs and optimize their training. And it's important for the prescription that it meets the client's needs and life changes, so you often have to modify it. And also their interests. You don't want to encourage them to perform cardiovascular exercise that they hate, because then they're less likely to adhere to exercise long term. And there's a couple of different kinds of goals that people may have, and the programs they might have similar components, but they look different in that some clients may choose to just pursue cardiovascular fitness training program to improve their health, because better cardiovascular fitness is associated with reduced mortality, better cognition, especially as we age, although it's been shown in young people as well. Or whether they're trying to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness. Maybe they have a performance goal that they wish to attain. And so these factors will affect the mode of exercise, the intensity of exercise, the frequency of exercise, the duration of exercise, and especially the exercise progression, because exercise progression will be very important as we talk about building cardiorespiratory fitness. Less important in terms of improving health, although you want to get your person to at least the minimal recommended cardiorespiratory fitness training each week, which is 30 minutes, moderate intensity physical activity, 5 days a week, 150 minutes in a week, or 20 minutes of vigorous intensity activity 3 days a week, or some combination of the two. So to improve health, you typically want to choose endurance type activities. And so these are large muscle group activities that increase heart rate, increase respiration, and that people enjoy, that they can do for a long period of time, so there's less stopping and starting, and that the intensity can be prescribed. And so a good way to prescribe intensity is in METs. So oftentimes if you when people use the equipment at the gym, that we'll talk about exercise intensity in terms of METs, so you can look on the machines, although you want to make sure that if they ask for your weight, they're adjusting their METs to weight, and the usual adjustment is 150 pounds. So if you weigh more or less than 150 pounds, make sure you adjust the weight calibration on the machines. But it also can be prescribed in terms of heart rate, in terms of RPE, and the frequency should be about 3 to 5 days a week, depending on moderate and vigorous intensity activity. And the duration, although it varies with the type of exercise and the intensity of exercise, and that if it's a more intense exercise, you don't have to perform it for as long. You want to have your people meet, or your person meet, at least the minimum amount of physical activity recommended by American Heart Association and American College of Sports Medicine, and that's 150 to 300 minutes per week. So this is 1,000 to 2,000 kilocalories per week. If someone wants to train cardiovascular training to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness, their prescription is going to look a little bit different, and especially you will need to pay more attention to intensity, because you want to be progressing the person in a way that improves their cardiorespiratory fitness, but doesn't allow them to become injured. And so it's that constant balance that you need to walk, or tightrope you need to walk between improving cardiorespiratory fitness and them being injured. So to improve cardiorespiratory fitness, exercise should be performed at least 5 days a week. That's of moderate intensity exercise, or 3 days of vigorous, or some combination of moderate and vigorous intensity activity. So 3 to 5 days a week. And the intensity should be at least moderate intensity physical activity. And so 40 to 60% of VO2 reserve, or 3 to 6 METs, and that's moderate intensity activity, or vigorous intensity activity, and that's greater than 6 METs, or greater than 60% of the VO2 reserve. And when you progress the activity, you'll have to think about intensity and how intensity plays into that progression. The type of activity should be rhythmical aerobic activities that can be maintained for long periods of time continuously, and that involve large muscle groups. When you're thinking about how much time someone should be training, continuous activity generally, or intermittent activity for at least 10-minute bouts. And so it depends on your person. If your person is very fit, then you want them to be doing some continuous activity during the week. They could do some intermittent activity, but if they are not trained at all, or they're older and they cannot endure continuous activity, then you can prescribe intermittent activity. And so it may be that they're walking for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and they're doing this 2 or 3 times a day. So you're working them up to that 150 minutes per week. The rate of progression of exercise depends on the goals and fitness of the person. If a person is more fit, then you're going to be able to progress them more rapidly than someone who's less fit. You're going to be able to progress intensity much sooner than for someone who's less fit. If they're less fit, you'll probably be increasing duration and frequency of exercise before intensity. Also, it depends on the person's goals. It depends on their propensity to injury. If they have a propensity to injury, you want to make sure you give them enough rest time between exercise intervals so that they're able to recover and take full advantage of that next exercise session. And you want to think about the where they are in their exercise stage, what phase they're in, whether they're in the initial conditioning phase, which this is in the first essentially 3 to 6 weeks of exercise training. If they've just started, are they in the improvement stage? And this is generally in those first few months, up to 8 months of continuous exercise. So this is from like 2 to 8 months of exercise, and people are increasing their cardiorespiratory fitness pretty rapidly in that improvement stage. Or are they in the maintenance stage where they're cardiorespiratory fit, they're happy with their cardiorespiratory fit, and now they're just trying to maintain that fitness level. And you want to think also about volume, and you want to think about having the initial goal, at least, is if your person isn't exercising for 1,000 kilocalories per week, that they should be exercising for 1,000 kilocalories per week. We've been talking about moderate and vigorous intensity aerobic activities. Well, this list isn't exhaustive, but it's a good start. And so generally you can think about moderate intensity activity is walking briskly, less or 3 miles per hour faster, but not race walking. Water aerobics, bicycling, less than 10 miles per hour, doubles, tennis, ballroom dancing, and general gardening are moderate intensity physical activity. You're increasing heart rate, you're breathing a little harder, but you don't feel like it's very hard. Vigorous intensity activity is race walking, jogging, or running. Swimming laps, so this is actively swimming. This isn't just splashing around in the pool, it's swimming laps. Tennis singles, aerobic dancing, so vigorous aerobic dancing, quick bicycling greater than 10 miles per hour. Jumping rope is vigorous activity. Heavy gardening, where you're digging, you're hoeing, and your heart rate increases. You're pulling weeds or something. Or if you're hiking uphill, or you're hiking and you have a heavy backpack. Those are the different types of moderate and vigorous intensity activities. And so when we think about cardiorespiratory exercise prescriptions, and we're thinking about increasing the amount of moderate and vigorous intensity activity that a person is doing, this is on top of their activities of daily living. So we want them to be active during their activities of daily living, at least moderately active every 5 to 10 minutes per hour, but the cardiorespiratory prescription is above and beyond those activities of daily living. And so when we think about what kinds of things what kind of modalities we can use for cardiorespiratory exercise prescription, we want to use large muscle groups, so legs, whole body exercises. We want it to be rhythmic exercises, so it can be continued. It can be continued at a constant intensity. We want to provide a mechanism to monitor intensity, and that's especially important initially when we start someone off exercising. And there'll be a list of exercises, and essentially we want to progress, so someone starts at type A and type B type of activities. And so if we look at this list, the type A type activities and the type B type activities, these are exercises or activities that people can maintain for a long period of time. They don't require much skill. The difference between type A activities and type B activities is type A activities are those activities that it doesn't require very much initial fitness to perform these activities for long periods of time. Whereas type B activities tend to be a bit more vigorous, and they require more fitness to be able to perform these activities for long periods of time. Type C activities require more skill, and so the ability to perform these activities for a longer period of time is dependent upon this building the skill to be able to perform these activities. And then type D activities are those activities with intermittent intensities. They're more stop and go. They're games. They are less continuous, and these types of activities can be used in someone's program to help to add variety. So if we think about the how to progress our person in our cardiorespiratory training program, we want to start them with type A and B fitness modalities, so the walking, the running, and then add C as they develop more skill and their fitness levels increase. And then those type D activities, those games and those more intermittent activities, can be added as the person has developed their cardiorespiratory fitness. So they're not depending upon these activities to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness. So typically when people are training their cardiorespiratory fitness, they want to cross-train. They don't want to stick with one exercise modality, and that's good because it adds variety to their program. It also allows them to train different muscle groups in different ways, all good things in terms of their health. So there's lots of options available beyond the walking, running, and cycling. But with the different types of exercise, what you may find is that at a similar oxygen consumption, heart rate may vary. And so if we look at this and we look at something like treadmill running, and so treadmill running and stair climbing have similar oxygen consumption. They have similar heart rates. They're taxing the cardiovascular system similarly. But when we start aerobic dancing, now we're using arms and legs and probably whatever kind of funky thing you decide to use with aerobic dancing. Heart rate is increased more than it is with these other types of exercise at the same oxygen consumption. So heart rate goes up, but you're not using more oxygen, you're not necessarily using more calories. But as long as you're exercising at a set percent of your VO2 max, you are able to improve cardiorespiratory fitness as long as the volume of exercise is controlled. So if you prefer to aerobic dance versus stair climb at a similar intensity, at a similar duration, a similar frequency, you're going to see similar improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness. What you'll also find is that at the same heart rate and the same or the same oxygen consumption response, you find that different levels of perceived exertion. So remember, relative perceived exertion is a subjective assessment of exercise intensity. And so at the same heart rate or the same VO2 max response, you find that you have a higher RPE when people are cycling versus when they're using the treadmill. And if you think about this, this makes sense because cycling, you're relying on a smaller muscle group, less frequently used muscle group than treadmill using, so you end up having more localized fatigue in the legs with cycling. But when you look at the so this is exercise modes, and you can see the similarity in these are the same oxygen consumption, the similarity in heart rate response, but across these exercise modes, studies have shown that treadmill running tends to be the highest caloric consuming exercise of these exercise modes. So the kind of advantage if you were wishing to enhance or to optimize your caloric consumption per minute of exercise. So progressing the cardiorespiratory exercise workload. So when you're thinking about what mode to have your person exercise at, whether it's cycling, whether it's running, whether it's the Stairmaster, whether it's elliptical, whatever it is, you want to make sure that you can progress their workload, progress frequency, duration, and intensity. You want to make sure it's something that intensity can be easily adjusted. And so something like the treadmill, you can increase the speed or increase the incline, and that increases the intensity. In cycling, you can increase the cadence or the resistance that you cycle against. In the step exercises, you can increase step cadence and height. Although if you increase the height, it increases the challenge of the bench stepping exercises and increases the caloric cost of that exercise, versus if you increase the stepping cadence. You could also progress the exercise by including upper body component to the exercise, like light hand weights with lower body exercise. When you do this, you'll have to be aware that when you start including the upper body exercise, that increases the workload on the heart. And so especially for people who have cardiovascular disease, you want to be careful about increasing or using lots of upper body components, such as light weights when they're exercising. You want to be mindful of that. And then if you have them doing something like, inline skating, well, you can increase the velocity of skating. Whereas something like a basketball game or handball is not as easy to adjust the intensity or to progress the intensity of those modalities of exercise. So that's why they're in that group that's more appropriate to add variety to someone's training program rather than develop their cardiorespiratory fitness. When you're working with older adults, you want to think about the modality a lot more carefully. Think about older adults may have balance issues, they may have vision issues, they may have coordination changes, and their muscles are also changing. Their muscles' ability to respond to the world is changing. So when you think about what kind of exercise you have them performing, you have to think about, so would you have them walking on a treadmill? You'd want to make sure it's not a dark, narrow treadmill belt. If you had them walking, would you have them walk on a track? Would you have them walk outside? Would you have them walk in the mall that's well lighted? There's less likely to be obstruction. So you really want to be mindful of your the challenges, the functional challenges that your person may present with. And walking and Tai Chi tend to be good options for older adults, although they can perform more vigorous activity if they're used to more vigorous activity, and you can progress them to more vigorous activities. But you want to consider what kind of challenges they're dealing with when they're performing the exercise. So from the cardiorespiratory testing, we can use a lot of that data to prescribe our exercise intensity. And that's going to be a key component because it's pretty easy to progress duration. You would just increase the time or the exercise bout time every couple weeks if that was appropriate for your person. You might increase it by 5 or 10 minutes. You could increase the frequency, maybe add an extra day. But the exercise intensity, you have to actually monitor the person or help them to monitor themselves to be able to make sure that they are meeting the exercise intensity that you're prescribing to them, because you want to think about the principle of overload, and that is that they need to perform exercises that are more challenging than what their body experiences every day, and more challenging over time to improve the fitness variables like cardiorespiratory fitness. And so it used to be that we would talk about exercise intensity in terms of VO2 max or percent of VO2 max. And so we would measure percent of VO2, or we'd measure VO2 max, and then prescribe exercise according to what percentage of their VO2 max someone was exercising at. This is not always easy for people to obtain a VO2 max test. So lots of people don't know what their VO2 max is. So it's easier for them to monitor their exercise intensity, for people to monitor their exercise intensity by monitoring heart rate. And so in order to link percent or VO2 with heart rate, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends now that we use a percent VO2 reserve instead of a percent VO2 max. And what we've found is that the exercise intensity at a particular percent VO2 reserve is equivalent to the exercise intensity at a percent heart rate reserve. So what we can say is you can recommend that someone exercise at a 50% VO2 reserve. That's equivalent to a 50% heart rate reserve. So they can monitor their heart rate knowing that they're exercising at that percentage of their VO2. Whereas if you recommend that someone exercise at 50% of their VO2 max, they might be at 40% of their VO2 reserve, and they might be at 35% of their heart rate reserve. And so it's less predictable. So because of the link between VO2 reserve and heart rate reserve, percent heart rate reserve, and the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that we use VO2 reserve or heart rate reserve to prescribe exercise intensity. And so VO2 reserve is just VO2 max, so mils per kilogram per minute, minus VO2 at rest. So remember, VO2 at rest is 3.5 mils per kilogram per minute. And VO2 reserve is directly related to a person's fitness level, so this is going to be higher if you're more fit. It's good to form the basis of exercise prescription, and it equates very well with heart rate reserve. You can also substitute METs, metabolic equivalents, for VO2. And remember, one MET is 3.5 mils per kilogram per minute VO2. So it's pretty easy if you're using METs to move into VO2, and also to prescribe that according to heart rate. We'll show how to do that. So if you're thinking about prescribing exercise using VO2 reserve, during the initial stage when people are just starting to become accustomed to exercise in that first 6 to 8 weeks, in that initial stage, most people will obtain cardiovascular benefits if they exercise in between 40 and 85% of their VO2 reserve. And so less fit people might generate cardiovascular benefit by exercising at 40% of their VO2 reserve, whereas more fit people will have to exercise more at 85% of their VO2 reserve. And so for sedentary or older individuals with poor initial fitness, you want to start them at a lower VO2 reserve. For healthy individuals, you might be able to start them right at the improvement stage. And the improvement stage, intensity increases, and now you may want to use 55 to 80% of someone's VO2 reserve to improve their cardiorespiratory and fitness levels. And then as they train over those 3 to 8 months, you want to monitor the exercise intensity and continuously tweak either frequency, duration, or intensity to be able to stimulate further cardiorespiratory improvements. And then once they're at the maintenance stage, they tend to want them to exercise at about 75 to 85% of their VO2 reserve. It seems like that's enough, or that's a high enough intensity for them to maintain their cardiorespiratory fitness. So to calculate VO2 reserve, so if you measured VO2 max or VO2 peak in someone and you found that it was 50 mils per kilogram per minute, and you determined that in order for them to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness, you wanted them to exercise at an intensity between 60 to 80% of their VO2 reserve. Because they're somewhat fit, they're not new to exercise, so you believe that this was a good intensity for them to start at. So to find their VO2 reserve, remember it's max VO2 minus resting VO2 gives you the VO2 reserve. So here's max minus resting gives you this VO2 reserve. And then if your target VO2 reserve is 60%, you take the VO2 reserve, multiply it by 0.6, and that will give you 60% of the VO2 reserve, and then you add back to get gross VO2, you add back 3.5 mils per kilogram per minute. And that will give you the 31.4 mils per kilogram per minute is the oxygen intensity that you want someone to exercise at. So it's about, it's a little less than 10 METs. 3.5 mils per kilogram per minute times 10 is, so that's about 35 mils per kilogram per minute. You want them to exercise in a range, because some days they'll feel good, some days they won't feel so good. So when they're feeling good, they can exercise at a higher intensity, or if they're on a rest day, they can exercise at a lower intensity. And so you prescribe a range, and that range for 80% of their VO2 reserve is, so you take their VO2 reserve times 0.8 and add the resting, and that gives you the VO2 for the or their target 80% of their VO2 reserve. So you can send them away, or send them at least out on their initial bout, and recommend that they keep their exercise intensity in this range. So about 10 to 12 METs. So if you wanted to calculate this using METs, so you wanted to use the percent VO2 reserve, and you want to calculate it using METs, remember 10 METs is 3.5 mils per kilogram per minute. And if your target intensity was 50% of the VO2 reserve, then you would take the max VO2 in METs minus resting VO2 and multiply that by 0.5. It'll give you the VO2 reserve in METs, and then you add the resting VO2, the resting VO2 of 1 MET, and that gives you the exercise intensity that is 50% of their VO2 reserve, but now it's in METs. So you could say to them, I'd like you to exercise at 50% of your VO2 reserve, which is 5.5 METs, for 30 minutes each day, 5 days a week, or something like that. So let's see. So did I do this right? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So if you wanted to then convert this back into VO2, all you'd have to do is multiply METs by the 1 MET oxygen consumption, and that will give you the VO2 that is equal to 50% of the VO2 reserve for your person. If you wanted to calculate what should the running speed be for my person, and so if you wanted to calculate, say that you wanted your person, you decided that you wanted them to be exercising at 8 METs, and so how fast should they be running to run at 8 METs? So you take your 8 METs, multiply it by the oxygen consumption for each MET, you get 28 mils per kilogram per minute. Now you can put this into the ACSM running equation for oxygen consumption. And so you'll recognize this as speed times 0.2 mils per kilogram per minute plus the resting exercise energy expenditure. And so this is if someone's running on a flat track. And so this allows you to calculate speed. So you'll take oxygen consumption, subtract the resting oxygen consumption, divide that by the cost of running each meter per minute, so mils per kilogram per minute, and you isolate the speed that the person should be running at. So it turns out to be 122.5 meters per minute is the speed. If you wanted to convert that to miles per hour, you divide meters per minute by 26.8 meters per mile, and you end up with 5.47 miles per hour is 8 mets. So if you wanted someone to exercise at 8 mets, you could tell them how quickly they should be running on a track. And so that would be 5.47 miles per hour. And to calculate running pace, so 60 minutes in an hour, you divide that by miles per hour that you want your person to be running. So from the previous example is 5.47 miles per hour. So divide 60 by 5.47, and you end up with, you want the person for an 8 met intensity, you want them running at 13.1 minutes per mile, or 8.1 minutes per kilometer if you use the European system. But think about, you want to think when you use METs, and one of the limitations of METs is METs are determined or have been determined from many studies of many individuals, many ages. And so some ages and some individuals and some genders have been overly represented in this compendium of studies. And so when you're considering METs, you want to know that it's primarily just a rough estimate. And so if you calculate in METs that your person should be using this much oxygen, they may not be using this much oxygen because they are at a different fitness level, they're at a different size than the people that those MET values were determined in. But they're a good estimate of energy expenditure, and if you're working with youth, the MET expenditure differs for adults. So you want to use a youth MET table if you're working with METs. You also want to think about environmental factors, things like whether it's hilly or whether it's polluted or whether it's hot are going to affect how much energy expenditure or how much oxygen consumption people are using while they're exercising. Also their skill level. People that are more skilled tend to use less oxygen and less energy than they may be predicted with the METs. So it's good to use METs, but also use heart rate and or relative perceived exertion. So you don't want to just send your person off and say, you must exercise at this MET. You want to give them more tools like heart rate and RP to monitor their exercise intensity. So you could use, if you've done a cardiorespiratory fitness test, you've monitored heart rate over a series of different workloads. And so you can use exercise, or you can monitor exercise intensity with heart rate. And it's easy to prescribe exercise intensity with heart rate, and it's very useful for most healthy people. Some of the limitations are that if you estimate heart rate max, like 220 minus age, like we did in class, or 208 minus 0.7 times age, those are estimations, and people's people's maximum heart rate varies by like 10 to 20 beats from that estimated max. And so for younger people, the heart rate max minus 220 tends to overestimate their maximum heart rate, whereas for older people, heart rate max 220 minus age tends to underestimate maximum heart rate. So there can be almost 20% difference in estimated heart rate max and actual heart rate max. So you want to be aware of that difference. And you want to, when possible, determine what maximal heart rate is when it's safe for your person. Also, heart rate depends on environmental conditions. It depends on whether they've had caffeine. It depends on whether they're stressed. It depends on the environment, whether it's hot, whether it's cold. And it also can depend on medical factors. Like, are they taking beta blockers? Are they taking vasodilators? What kinds of medications are they on? Are they on antihistamines? Those medications tend to affect tend to affect heart rate. But if you decide that you'd like to use heart rate to monitor exercise intensity, there are several different methods. And so these are 3 of the most common methods, and we'll talk about those. So if you have the results of a cardiorespiratory fitness test, you've conducted a graded exercise test, you can record heart rate and plot heart rate steady state, so the steady state heart rate at each different workload stage. And if you plot heart rate on the y-axis and exercise intensity by METs or VO2 max on the x-axis, you can determine what a person's heart rate is, so heart rate at a particular workload. So this is, we have had the person exercise at different workloads, steady state workloads, and we have recorded the workloads and recorded the heart rate at those workloads. And so this could be a maximal test, or this could be a submaximal test. And if you plot at least 3 different workloads, you're able to determine or correlate the exercise workload with heart rate. And if you know what their max heart rate is, then you can determine the percentage of their VO2 reserve, or the percentage of their heart rate reserve that you want them training at. So if you don't have a maximal graded exercise test, you can extrapolate or estimate heart rate max to help to determine the VO2 reserve range you want them training at. And then once you determine that range, you can locate the corresponding heart rates and determine the heart rate range. But what you want to think is that different exercise modalities produce different heart rate responses. So that's why it's really important that the test, the cardiorespiratory test that you're doing with your person, should correlate very well with their training mode, so that they can use heart rate values or workload values to predict heart rate values. So if we determine for our person 3 submaximal workloads, and then we estimated for our person their heart rate max, we add another point, and we estimate that heart rate max as 200 or something, 190, I guess. Then we can determine what their maximal workload is, so about a little over 7 METs. And if we decide that we want them working in a MET zone that's equal to about 60 to 85% of their VO2 reserve, we can, with this plotted line, now look at the heart rate range that we want them training in. And again, it's important to give them a range for daily variability, and also because it's difficult to maintain your heart rate at one level for a continuous period. It's going to fluctuate quite a bit. If you haven't done an actual test to determine heart rate max, you can use heart rate reserve. And so this is very easy. So heart rate reserve is, you determine the exercise intensity that you want them to exercise at. That depends on their fitness, their phases of exercise they're in, and you multiply this by their heart rate reserve. And their heart rate reserve is determined by their heart rate max minus their resting heart rate. You multiply that by your exercise intensity, and you add back their resting heart rate method. So this is also called the Kravonen method. Heart rate reserve, Kravonen method, the same thing. And percent heart rate reserve closely approximates percent heart rate or percent VO2 reserve. So they're really, they can be used together. And generally for most people, you want to set programs that range between 40 and 85% of their heart rate reserve. Less fit people, more towards 40, more fit people, more towards 85%. You could also prescribe exercise according to someone's percent heart rate max. and this is a pretty easy method to use. The problem is it doesn't correlate 1-to-1 with percent VO2 reserve or percent heart rate reserve. And so generally percent heart rate max is, so especially if you don't have an actual measured percent heart rate max or heart rate max and you've estimated it, there can be lots of variability. So you want to try to measure heart rate max when you can, and also be aware of if your person is on medications that might affect heart rate. But healthy people not on medications that affect their heart rate max, you generally want to set their program between 60 and 94% of their heart rate max. And this corresponds to about 45 to 85% of their VO2 reserve or their heart rate reserve. And so again, program the lower end of the range for those with lower cardiorespiratory fitness values. And if you tell someone a percent heart rate max, like 50% of heart rate max, is going to give you a much lower intensity than 50% of the heart rate reserve. 50% of the heart rate reserve is going to be a lot higher intensity than 50% of heart rate max. And so you want to be aware of this, especially when you're working with older clients or less fit clients. And if no actual heart rate max is available, then you can estimate it. And so this just shows you for healthy adults, so very generally, where to start their exercise. And so here's a cardiorespiratory classification, so poor, fair, average, good, excellent. If you want to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness, then you're going to have someone who has excellent cardiorespiratory fitness exercising more towards 70 to 85% of their heart rate reserve, or VO2 reserve, versus someone who has poor cardiorespiratory fitness is more towards 30 to 45% of their heart rate reserve. This is, so this range of heart rate reserve, or VO2 reserve, is equal to 57 to 67% of the heart rate max. So a much higher percent of heart rate max to give you the same exercise intensity, because you're not taking into consideration in this calculation someone's resting heart rate. So there's a lot more variability. And for someone who has excellent fitness, you want them exercising 84 to 94% of the heart rate max. And so relative perceived exertion, so for the fair or poor, if you have someone exercising at a light to moderate, so this could be 3 to 4 or 5 RPE, that's going to be sufficient to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness. Whereas for someone who has excellent cardiorespiratory fitness, you want them exercising more in their somewhat hard range, so more of a 7 or 8 or maybe even 9 RPE on the 1 to 10 scale. You could also use, so we can also use relative perceived exertion to determine exercise intensity. So even though relative perceived exertion is a subjective assessment of the intensity of exercise, it correlates very, very well with physiological parameters, things like heart rate, some studies have suggested, also things like lactate threshold. RPE levels tend to correlate pretty closely with lactate thresholds. And so RPE is a subjective interpretation of effort in the client, and the client scores their effort required. So whether it's whether you use an RPE scale or a pictorial Omni scale, there's several in your book that show like very nice people and they're running up this steep incline, and then it gives you gradings of, or numerical ratings of like 1 through 10. So when you're using the Borg RPE scale, generally a 12 to 16 approximates 40 to 85% of heart rate reserve. So this is where most people should be training. And again, if someone's less fit, they train more towards 12. If someone's more fit, they train more towards 16. And you may use RPE instead of heart rate, because if you think about if someone's exercising, it's a lot easier. They don't have to stop, try to find their heart rate. And so it's easy for them to be able to monitor their exercise intensity versus trying to find their pulse. And for some types of exercise, It's very difficult to measure heart rate, and so